Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is an exciting panel on precision diagnostics in emergency medicine, and we have a great moderator today. I will introduce Maya Yadon, who's a faculty here at our Stanford Department of Emergency Medicine. She's going to be leading the discussion with this handpicked group of expert panelists. I will let her introduce them and hopefully lead us into an amazing discussion this afternoon. Maya, I'll leave you to it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining this panel. As was mentioned, we'll be talking about the future of precision diagnostics in emergency medicine. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. As a researcher and a clinical operations specialist, a lot of what I spend my time thinking about are areas where our systems break down, where we don't do what we say we're looking to do clinically, and finding ways to do it better. And really precision being the ultimate goal. And so in some circles, we talk about precision statistically in a way that's not quite what we're looking to achieve. We're actually talking a little bit more about accuracy, getting the right care for each patient when they need it, and really focusing on both process and diseases. So it's my pleasure to be able to have this panel to join this discussion. We have some experts here who've been tackling this from a dualistic perspective and some other insights as well. One is really looking at the front lines for when things need to happen on an emergency care basis. The other is actually looking at the technology side and seeing what's available, what could be available to really merge and bridge what we're looking to do in emergency medicine with what is possible. And so with that, what I'll do is I'll give everyone just a brief one-liner on each one of our panelists, and then we'll go around and let them tell you a little bit more about what they do and personally are interested in, as well as what they work on with their teams. And so first, I'll start with Bob Jr. Bobby is the CEO and founder of Prognosis. Prognosis is a company that is exploring machine learning and biomarkers to make more precise diagnoses of infectious disease. So thank you for joining us, Bobby. We also have Dr. Tim Sweeney, who is the co-founder and CEO of Inflamatics. Inflamatics is a company developing tests for accurate bacterial infections, viral infections, and sepsis based on biomarkers that are actually currently patented or being evaluated at different stages of development. So thank you for joining, Tim. We have Dr. Jeremiah Henson, who's the Director of Research in the Johns Hopkins Department of Emergency Medicine, so East Coast counterpart to our West Coast operation here at Stanford in emergency medicine. And Dr. Henson's research is on increasing the utility of pre-existing electronic health record data to improve decision-making, of which diagnosis is one aspect, but also using machine learning, artificial intelligence, and improving the presentation of information so that it can actually be used more effectively. So thanks for joining as well, Jeremiah. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Diku Mandavia, who is the CMO of BrainScope, also emergency medicine faculty at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. BrainScope is a non-invasive medical device that objectively assesses head injury patients for both brain bleeds and concussions at the point of care. And so with that, I'll let our panelists tell you a little bit more about what they do. Looks like we have more people joining us as well, and we will start with Bobby. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Thanks so much, Maya, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to speak to this panel. So I'll tell you just a little bit about Prognosis. So we're based in Chicago. What we basically do, we like to say, is we build maps and GPS systems to better understand and profile patients amongst kind of the vast heterogeneity of disease. I think this panel is really relevant to what we do, just because we feel that in hospitals and in emergency departments today, we still kind of overall use one-size-fits-all protocols and approaches to treat many of the patients that come into EDs in the hospitals. So our goal is really to change that and to enable precision medicine in emergency departments and hospitals by building these maps and the GPS systems. So we think, similar to what has really made a difference in cancer, we need to do the same thing in the hospital and the ED. So what we do is we grow a proprietary data set that combines a lot of different biomarkers with clinical data from the EHR to better map out the heterogeneity of disease. And then we build the systems that in real time can gather the data needed to place a patient on those maps and to suggest the optimal treatment for the patient. So we've been growing that data set in collaboration with 8 different hospitals, and really excited to usher in this next generation of precision medicine.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Bobby. And maybe next I'll hand over to, we could move over to Tim.
Sure, thanks. So just personally, my background was in clinical medicine. Actually, I trained at Stanford in general surgery for 4 years before ending up as a postdoc in biomedical informatics and machine learning with my now co-founder, Pravesh Khatri, still a professor in computational immunology there. And the original idea was to better diagnose post-op infections using circulating mRNAs from the blood, really sort of patterns of expression within white blood cells. But over the years, that turned into a desire for a test that could more quickly give a physician diagnostic and prognostic information when a patient is just presenting with signs and symptoms of acute inflammation. So Informatics next year will launch the Triverity test, which will be the first one of our pipeline. It's one of these cartridge-based tests. Basically, you can click a blood tube right in here. We have onboard reagents for RNA extraction. Then there's a sort of an array of wells. And we measure a bunch of mRNAs quantitatively in about 30 minutes. And that first test basically will say, hey, whether or not a patient in front of you has a bacterial infection, whether or not they have a viral infection. By the way, that could be both negative, meaning non-infectious, look somewhere else. We can also predict the need for 7-day ICU interventions. And that's the first of a pipeline of many tests that all look at gene signatures as a way of generally informing on better diagnostic, prognostic, or therapy response prediction across a range of really acute and critical indications. So looking forward to the panel today. I think it's a great time to be innovating in emergency medicine.
Fantastic. Jeremiah.
Sure, thanks. So I have kind of a mixed background as well. So I first trained University of North Carolina, did a PhD in molecular pathology, and then I went to medical school in the Bronx at Einstein. Came and did an EM residency, which was not expected, but I just really liked the field. So did an EM residency at Hopkins where I stayed, and I backed into data science here. So inside the department, I work with as the assistant director of research, done a lot of work in sepsis doing clinical trials and diagnostics evaluation. We're building a embedded diagnostics incubator within our emergency department right now that'll go live in a month or two. I'm also the co-director and co-founder of a Center for Data Science in EM here, and we have multiple R awards to develop and study artificial intelligence-driven decision support with predictive models to improve diagnosis and risk stratification of patients in general. And then finally, I work as a chief medical officer for a Hopkins spin-out company called Stochastic. So the way that works, it was an SF-funded company initially, now private. And when we develop a technology that is useful through research, it then spins out into the company so that we can disseminate it across the country. And so we have a few tools that are commercialized now as well. But we're inside Hopkins always collaborating with industry as well to evaluate tools that have been developed. So.
Yeah, that's a great jumping off point. And then also Diku, if you'll go next.
Well, thank you, Maya. It's an honor to be here. So my background is emergency medicine as well. I trained at USC and I'm still part-time faculty there. But I've been a med tech executive for the last 15 years, and I've been involved with disruptive medical technologies. And it's interesting to hear they had a lively discussion around point-of-care ultrasound. I spent a lot of my career around that. I was the chief medical officer for Sonosite and then subsequently for Fujifilm. So I know what it takes to get a disruptive technology in active use. And most recently, I'm with a very exciting company called BrainScope. You may not have heard about BrainScope, but BrainScope has really developed a breakthrough device. They spent about a decade building a point-of-care device where we can now, as emergency physicians, evaluate the head-injured patient and reliably exclude an intracranial hemorrhage, as well, furthermore, really get an idea of their level of concussion. And that's really a game changer. So you talk about precision medicine, you talk about emergency medicine getting more sophisticated in management of minor head injury. I think that's a real game changer. In emergency medicine, the care pathway for head injury hasn't changed for decades. We've had a blunt instrument called a CT scan, and that was the only pathway. It's a CT or no CT. So the fact that we have a point-of-care device that gives you an answer, right, at the bedside, you don't need a radiologist, a neurologist. You as an emergency physician are empowered. Again, that would not be possible without a full decade of research, which was largely funded by the Department of Defense, well over $30 million of R&D effort from them. We have over 30 papers and nearly 90 patents. So this device is now just getting commercialized, and I think about to change the way we practice medicine around head injury.
That's fantastic. And I think one of the themes that's coming out from the approach that everybody here seems to be taking is really understanding the clinical problem and then developing the tech to address that. And that was something that came up in one of our earlier panels, is that, often AI and innovation is almost a hammer looking for a nail, whereas, oftentimes starting with the nail is where you actually get the biggest bang for your buck. And so if you all wouldn't mind commenting on your approaches to doing just that, it would sort of fill out the discussion we've been having throughout the day.
I guess I'll start. I mean, as practicing clinicians, it's about solving a problem. We see a lot of technologies. In fact, in my experience as a med tech executive, I see a lot of different companies and technologies that are interesting, but don't really solve a really important problem. And I think that's where companies need to be grounded. That's why actually I think having physicians as part of their advisory group or even as part of their executive team really helps in their direction and really helps them become successful, because the end game is actually helping patients, right? And you can't help patients if you don't know the problems to solve. And so I actually am very excited that Stanford's hosting a conference like this. I think emergency medicine is now at the level of sophistication that we should be playing an active role with med tech companies in solving the problems. And we're the ones that best know those problems.
Additional.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I don't think it will surprise anyone to hear the idea of having physicians involved early is great. Maybe a counterexample is, in sepsis detection, what I learned, having moved over from being a physician for a long time, is tens, dozens, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on more rapid ways to detect bacteremia, right? And that's maybe a worthwhile goal, but it's always sold to investors as we're 99% accurate versus blood culture, and this thing's going to revolutionize medicine. And there's the sort of missing piece of like, well, blood cultures aren't great tests, right? And you may know that if you've practiced, but that missing piece of the experience, the clinician's experience, like, what do you want? Do you need to know about bacteremia in particular, or do you want to know, what treatment are you choosing for this patient? Do they need antibiotics? Is it something else? So that, there was probably 15, 20 years of sort of a lack of connection between what do physicians actually need in order to move forward with the patient right now versus what can the industry supply from a push side. And so I think the more we focus on how can we make a test actionable, what decision will be made downstream of this, and is that something that's really going to impact patient outcomes if we make it in a better manner? That I think is how we've tended to find our most successful ideas and move them into the pipeline.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is decision. The word decision, and then like what the action will be that follows. There are a lot of things that are like comparing to blood cultures. As an emergency physician, I don't actually care what the blood culture result is because I'll never see it, right? So what is the decision that I make on the blood culture, like whether to order it or not? So if something, it is compared to that, and that's kind of the decision I'm replacing. It's not replacing anything. So I think we see a lot of things come out that they solve when working with industry, we often see that people are solving the wrong problem. There's not a good understanding of what our problem in the emergency department is. It's a technology that's developed by someone downstream based on their perception of what our problem is. And we've done a lot of these kind of activities where we will bring someone in from industry, multiple large companies, and just do fact-finding missions. And you put a pharmacist and an ID physician, an intensive care physician, and an emergency physician in a room and talk about a problem, and everyone understands the problem differently. When you have the wrong person kind of trying to develop a solution, it becomes problematic. So I think when you're developing things for the emergency department specifically, having the right people in the room who understand decision making in that environment is critical. I think the other thing is about information. So often there's a decision and there's an action that follows, and the question or the assumption is often that we don't have the information that we need. But oftentimes it's not that we don't have the information, it's that we don't have the cognitive bandwidth to interpret the information and act on it, make the right decisions. So I think that's actually a big factor, is understanding whether the information that you're trying to create already exists in some form, and it just is not being used. And how do you get someone to use that information or be able to interpret it in real time?
So, I think... Go right ahead, Bobby, sorry.
Yeah, I'll just chime in briefly. I think it's a great topic. I think it's a classic mistake that engineers and scientists make all the time, right? Is use a tool and search for a problem. Just one thing to add to what these guys said. I think when it comes to AI and ML in particular, I think everybody knows that these algorithms and these techniques are only as good as the data that you input into them. The techniques themselves are actually quite stupid, but it's really just about the data, right? It's about the data that you use to train these algorithms. And I think that when it comes to problem-based development, we really think it's about generating or getting the right data to solve a problem. And I think in the field, a lot of people either do one of two things. They either just use existing data that's out there and just kind of hope that it's going to be the right data to solve the problem that they're looking for, or they're very tool-focused and they have a tool that they want to commercialize and they only get data from that tool. So I think instead of that, a more holistic approach of saying, this is the problem I want to solve. These are all the different data elements that we would need to solve that problem. And then if many of these data elements don't exist, you can't just hide your head in the sand and just say, I'm not going to use those data elements. You need to go out and get the data. So I think being more holistic and making sure that the data sets that you're building these algorithms and everything on match the problem you're trying to solve is really critical.
And so, Bobby and Tim, I know this is work that you have embarked on, and I believe the whole group as well. But when the current environment doesn't have the data you're looking for, so step one is see what data is available to you and what you can ascertain with that. But then when you identify that you need additional data, how do you cross that bridge? And do you cross that bridge at all times?
Yeah, I guess I can start. I think that for us, what we did is we looked at all of the literature that was available. For example, starting in sepsis, and we said that, okay, there's all these parameters that have already been very well studied, right? Things ranging from, just as simple as age, as demographic information, to as complex as, more detailed blood-based biomarkers. And there was a lot of literature out in the field, and we said, well, all of this is very well studied, and a lot of it can be pretty well understood in terms of representing different biological pathways. And so when we were creating our data set, we tried to make sure that we were covering all the different dimensions of better understanding disease. One example I like to use is that if you're trying to model a three-dimensional object, then if you only have X and Y data and you have no Z data, no matter how much X and Y data you get, you're never going to be able to really model that three-dimensional object. So we tried to use our best understanding of biology to cover all the different dimensions that would be important to model these different conditions. And then we went out and decided to get that data if we didn't have it.
I think my 2 cents would be our platform looks at mRNA signatures, and so it's not something that sits in the medical record. It's not something for which there's millions of things, millions of data points available. What we had to do was start small and say, here's a feasibility signature. We'd like to work with some folks, test it in your databases, and generate some new data sets, and then that was successful. And then sort of we could incorporate that test data back into training. And then we had a better signature and a little bit, more resources to do some more prospective validations, and we could test it and put it back into training. That's an iterative process that's taken a long time. It'll actually be our 4th generation signature that goes through FDA. But, its performance has improved a lot over time. And the other thing that does, it leaves a nice long trail of literature showing that a given test works not just in one population one time or according to a certain inclusion criteria, but broadly in different conditions and different hospitals and different patient types. And I think ultimately what does a clinician want? They want a tool that works, right? That doesn't change its characteristics vastly depending on if they're on the East Coast or the West Coast or using it in slightly different patient populations. All of which is to say, it is really hard, and gathering data on which to build tools is probably one of the things that we think about the most. But if it were easy, they wouldn't call it research, right? If you only had to do it one time, it would just be search. So I think that's the idea.
It's a great point. And, I think a lot of the validity of that work really requires, the skill set that comes from the clinical frontline, as well as knowing the details of how the decisions are going to be made in order to incrementally take those steps, prove value, as you all have said, and then build off of that. Earlier as well, we had talked about how important it is for physicians to be part of the use case for what's being developed and to really refine that and keep it true to what's needed on the ground. In emergency medicine, earlier in the day, we were talking about how we're often a microcosm of decisions, questions, and issues in medicine. And so I'm curious to know if through your work you found opportunities, and this is not to say that surgeons don't also have important things to offer medicine, but emergency medicine is special. And do you see ways beyond just physicians influencing what the use case is and where the targeted direction goes, that emergency medicine can make a specific contribution given our unique environment and skill sets?
I'll give you a good example. Point-of-care ultrasound. Let's talk about ultrasound itself. And, that you could say was a technology that was largely in the hands of the radiologist in the beginning, right? And the actual value of ultrasound would never have been unlocked had it not gotten to point of care. In fact, I think a lot of people would agree the fact that it got to point of care, which was actually driven by emergency medicine, allowed us to actually use that technology in many parts of the body, which radiologists would not even thought about. Right? Whether it's a patient with acute vision loss and doing an ocular ultrasound, or a patient with dyspnea that we're doing a lung ultrasound, or the patient in shock that we're doing hemodynamic assessments. That requires a clinician that is broad-based. Emergency medicine is a great one, so we obviously take care of every organ of the body, and is more open-minded. And I think that's really important. My experience is, different specialties think of things in different ways. And it's funny, not funny, for us to talk about precision diagnostics, we're probably talking about some innovation, we're talking about some disruption. It's about breaking convention, right? And so if, maybe there's a day we never do a blood culture, but if you're an ID doctor, your life is blood cultures, right? But if we all agree taking care of patients and getting an outcome is really what we want, maybe blood cultures are yesterday's technology. I just throw that as an example. I know we have experts here that know more about it, but I bring this up because I think our colleagues in emergency medicine, certainly I actually like working with the residents the best. They think so out of the box. When I give them an ultrasound probe and they'll start scanning some part of the body no one has even written about. And guess what? They're finding really interesting things. And so that's exciting. I think I'm excited that our specialty can contribute. And, this wouldn't have been the case, say, 20 years ago because we were just growing. But we're now in a place that we have a lot of academic minds, a lot of great clinicians, and a lot of people that have, multiple other interests that marry with a particular clinical application that can solve a problem.
I mean,
go ahead, Jeremiah.
I totally agree with you. And I think that, sometimes you have innovation by necessity, which I think happens in the ED, right? So we may not have enough information to make the decision that someone else may make later on. It's the site of greatest uncertainty in the hospital. And what we have found in our group is when we start to work with industry, they'll have been working on a problem for a long time. And then they get into the emergency department and start working with people who are receiving people and have a fresh slate. And it's a whole different problem. So we're the ones that are bringing them in. We have the first look at the patient, and we're setting the trajectory for up to 70% of all hospitalized patients right now, just because that's the way medicine has sort of changed. So I think that emergency medicine is the place for research, for clinical research, where everything will be starting moving forward. And we've found that every time we get involved with someone who's been not engaged with the emergency department, they're coming back to us wanting to do more and more projects because it is a place where decision-making density is highest, uncertainty is highest, It's a really great place to do this kind of work.
That's not bad.
And
Other
I'll
thoughts?
just chime in with the obvious.
Yeah.
I'll just chime in with the obvious, which is that most patients that end up in the hospital come through the ED, and so that's where you have the first opportunity to make the right decisions. And so I think at the beginning, at the top of the funnel, it's especially important to get things right.
Now, yeah.
If I could add one, I mean, you asked sort of what could eMed docs do. There are examples right here on the screen, folks that are willing to do clinical research. But it's a very, very busy place. The last thing you want to be doing is sitting down and consenting patients. But patients 12 hours later, 24 hours later, they're a different patient. And often we need work done in the emergency department. I think it's a lot easier to get clinical research done in slower paced environments. So the one thing I would say is, if there was a key to unlocking more innovation, certainly at least one of those keys would be in just improving sort of clinical research broadly across emergency medicine. There's great centers of excellence, but that's, I think, the typical challenge in the space.
No, and I'm curious to know, in your explorations of this area, emergency medicine, and thinking about really even more broadly speaking, the acute phase of disease, which can happen anywhere, just happens to be what we spend our time addressing when people contact the health system. Where do you see the next barrier that we need to break in terms of achieving precision diagnosis, using tech or maximizing the use of tech? Earlier we talked about how we're figuring out how to use tools like machine learning and AI. We're figuring out that it's really important to identify the problem. And we're doing all that work, but what do you see as the limiting step that we really need to get past to make this a reality that touches patients' lives?
Well, I think, as we develop disruptive technologies, by default, the adjective disruptive means that our colleagues are probably not going to be adopters or early adopters, right? So I think that it's not just the tech, it's about the adoption of the tech. And it's a lot about market adoption. And there's a lot of things that influence market adoption, as you know, and there's lots of examples, whether you talk about ultrasound or video airway or other techniques that we've now integrated. They take time. So we as a specialty should be open to new care pathways, new technologies. If we really think that we are an important part of the healthcare system where all the patients that get admitted come through, and we potentially have a big impact, we as a specialty should be first to say, yeah, let's take a look at this technology. Let's not stay in convention. Let's be open-minded and let's see what we can do. And I think when we do that, a lot of good things can happen. My experience is it takes a while, just because we're physicians. Right. As physicians, we go through med school, you go through residency. Well, I didn't learn that in residency, right? All these technologies we talked about today, none of us learned about that in residency. But so we need to be open-minded, and I hope, as especially we are meeting our colleagues, because I think ultimately patients will benefit.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that prevents new diagnostics from being implemented outside of what you were just talking about is that not a lot of companies do these studies that directly link diagnostics to outcomes and to, in many cases, financial outcomes for hospitals. Obviously in therapeutic trials, that's really important, right? You always have to link the drug to whether or not it actually helps mortality, right? And eventually you make a financial argument. I think in diagnostics, that's been pretty rare, where you see these multi-center trials that link diagnostics to improved outcomes. And I think when you go and you try to convince a new hospital to adopt it, the lack of that data can make it very difficult to get widespread adoption. So I think seeing more of those actual interventional trials with diagnostics where you show that you actually make an impact on multiple centers could be something that would help to build confidence.
I think part of it is also providing support around a new bit of information, right? So a new diagnostic, the information may be great, but it's challenging to incorporate that into our practice and to change the way we're treating patients based on that information if we don't know exactly what to do with it. And there can be papers published on it. There could be, emails sent out to us, things presented at a faculty meeting about how to use this new diagnostic and how it could change things. But in real time, when you're overwhelmed with an information flow, if it's just another piece of information, it becomes very difficult to use. So we've seen that with some things that have come out and are populated in the EHR, and they're just not used. That's because this is a new bit of information. So you already have a workflow, and if you don't know how to integrate that new bit of information into your existing workflow and how to change, it can be really difficult to do that. So the implementation of this stuff, everybody on this panel has developed incredible technology, but the implementation is really, really important. And I think what you were saying earlier, Maya, maybe even hinting at, is that I think there's some very important user-centered design that needs to happen in how we push this stuff out to clinicians. It has to make an emergency physician's life easier, because anything that makes it slightly harder is just going to get ignored, unless the benefit is massive. So I think that's one thing we have to really think about.
Yeah, I think we should stop thinking about diagnostics and we start thinking about diagnostics that are integrated into clinical decision support, that is integrated into workflow. Like, all of this needs to be a unified platform, because just by itself, a diagnostic could be the most amazing thing in the world, but it doesn't make an impact unless people know how to use it properly. And
one of the things that moves the needle with doctors is evidence. And I think you were hinting earlier that where we need those studies that actually look at the clinical outcomes that we care about and prove that there's actually impact, not just that it's cool, not that it competes with processes that we use in an effective way, but that it actually delivers outcomes that make patients do better. And with that, I feel like you get physicians' ears open to being ready for change. Then there's the whole work of like, well, how do we do the change? But at least now you can start. What's your experience with that degree of rigorous testing? We think of drugs and devices. They're required to have this level of testing to make it to the clinical environment, whereas we don't quite have that system in place. I think it's evolving for machine learning, decision support, and diagnostics. With laboratory testing, it's in play. But what's your experience with how this all pulls together and whether that rigor exists and where you've seen it be successful?
I think that system actually is in place. It's a little bit hidden, so if you want to be a successful company, and the question was asked in the chat, if you want to be a successful company selling diagnostics, you have to figure out your reimbursement schema. Well, you're not going to get reimbursed at any kind of CMS or MAC level if you don't have good outcomes data. I think where that tends to manifest itself is much earlier in the work stream, right? When you're sort of approaching venture capitalists for funding, and they're looking at, well, first you got to build this thing, then you got to get it FDA cleared, then you got to prove that it works, then there's a funding decision that might come years later, then at some point you have a guideline adoption, and then and only then sort of will sales take off. And that's whatever, it's the system we live in. I'm not complaining that it's unfair or anything, but it requires a lot of fortitude, and I think it's one of the reasons that there has been perhaps less innovation than there could have been. Now, there's been some proposals to increase transitional funding during the accumulation of that sort of evidence. And to the extent that emergency physicians are interested in supporting that, certainly advocacy at the federal level for those kinds of transitional programs would be very useful.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there definitely are systems in place, and diagnostics do get adopted eventually, right? I mean, there are several successful diagnostics, so people do find a way. I think a lot of this also comes back to what we were just talking about, which is that the past of diagnostics development has been you develop a test and you try to sell the test. Whereas I think the future is going to be an integrated platform where, the reason why diagnostic companies don't run these large trials is because they're scared that it's not going to work. And you run it and you spend, these are very expensive trials, and they can take a long time. You invest all this money, and if it doesn't work, then you're kind of dead in the water, right? And so the risk reward profile, I think, is not appropriate for diagnostic companies to spend a ton of money doing this. But I think in the future, if we really do have these integrated platforms where you're not selling a diagnostic, you're selling a whole platform that gives the right information, puts that in a presentable way to the physician, and then kind of chases after them to make sure that they're making the decisions that you hope that they're making, or in conjunction with your products, they're making the right decisions. I think that's going to be the future. And then when that happens, then maybe the risk reward profile of running these trials will be more favorable, and companies will want to do it more often.
So we've touched on the idea of making better decisions, providing better quality data. The financial side, where if you can't sell it, you're probably not going to be able to use it. And maybe changing what you're trying to sell to maybe not being the test, but actually the platform that the test is sort of built off of. But what about equity? And so this is, often when we're testing how well we diagnose or screen or treat patients, we're looking at clusters of patients and saying, of all the patients who had a pneumonia, we captured them, or we captured them in a timely fashion, or we treated them effectively. But what seems to be emerging in our field is this idea about what about all the subgroups? These patients have different socioeconomic strata, different races, different neighborhoods in the area around a facility. How do we do this work so that we're not precise just for the whole? And then the ones we missed, if they all happen to be in one group, well, it was just really good over the whole, so it's okay. Are you doing work that's really looking at equity, and where do you think we can probably advance work in this space?
So we put a preprint online about a month ago, looking at that exact question: how does our algorithm perform over different races, sexes, various other demographic subgroups, ages? And in the paper, we sort of say, well, look, it's better than standard of care. It's not perfect. But I think one of the things it suggests is, if you're using, one biomarker, your typical X-ray, whatever it is for diagnosis, with no attention to subgroups, then, standard of care itself is not perfect, right? Everyone has seen the many, many papers that look at the subtleties that can come up in especially AI algorithms, things looking like, image interpretation, HR-based AI, that can have substantial demographic subgroup differences. But what we showed, and what others I think are showing too, is if AI offers sort of a promise of better future, which is it's the one modality where if you want to be attentive to subgroup representation, you can be very effective and produce a product that is much more equitable and bias-free, because it sort of allows you to tweak the inner workings of the product, right? And so I think the future is bright once the problem has been identified. And the reality is every manufacturer should care about this, because it makes a product that works better, works more effectively across more subgroups. So I would say in the long run, the answer is we just have to be attentive to making sure that we are systematically identifying the biases in our products and working to exclude them. But I think it is very possible and should yield better products in the future.
I think that's a great answer, Tim. And I think a lot of it depends, I think, on the product that you're talking about. Like, where is the bias coming from, and understanding that. So I would imagine that for you all at Informatics, it's about the data sets that you're using to train on, right? So who participated in that original research? Whereas, we're looking at EHR data, and we can eliminate every explicit variable that deals with race, ethnicity, things like that from an algorithm, but there are a lot of hidden variables. So I'll give an example. We have a tool that identifies risk stratifies people for risk of having a critical outcome at triage, and then the tool is applied to the entire population. So we retrain the tool locally at every ED we go to. And the people that it performs best for are the local population, the people who look most like the people who are local. And the reason is because it uses past medical history. And so past medical history is missing for the people who don't usually frequent that ED. So at Hopkins, our model performs least well for white patients because our local population is non-white. And so when white patients are coming in as transfers for extended care or specialized care, those people it performs least well for. So it's kind of a surprising result. But I think, the more we explore how these biases are created and then how we can correct for them, I think we have the ability to do it. Whereas it's very hard to do it as a human being, to correct them as human beings. We will work on it continually, but I think we have the ability to correct for them in algorithms or to work at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything these guys said. I think there's three pieces, and they both kind of covered it. But I think the first piece is the training data. You need to make sure that you have good enough representation in the training data, and you need to be conscious about that. And if you do have large gaps in the training data, whether it's due to something like race or it's due to a biological signature, you need to be looking at all sorts of different representations there and make sure that you have enough representation when you build these algorithms. I think the second piece, which we didn't talk about, is then also transparency when you give a result. So when you give a result, if you really didn't see many patients like that in your past training data set, you should be transparent to the user. And you should say, here's the result, but I'm actually not that confident here because I don't have that much representation here. So I think post-release, if you can give a level of confidence that relates to the sparsity or density of the training data that looks similar to that past patient, I think that's really important. Then the third piece, which these guys talked about, is kind of like the post-market surveillance, which is that you're never done. You release a product and you might get it FDA approved and everything, but you need to constantly monitor and see what populations you might be underserving, and then go back and be willing to kind of refine the product once you have that data.
And so this is interesting because I think many folks one of the buzzwords that's floating out there's this concept of algorithmic equity, that an algorithm is going to balance what as humans we might be biased to introduce, but the other side, and I think you brought this up, Jeremiah, sometimes the data itself is biased in a way that has nothing to do with what's happening socioeconomically out in our community, and if we're not aware of both sides,
the data is always biased.
The data is always biased.
Almost by definition, is always biased. There was something.
And those biases aren't necessarily the same social biases or environmental or practice biases. So really, there are a couple different aspects to bias that you all have highlighted that seem like they're really important. And I'm curious to know, what have you done to address those biases in your work? Tim, you talked about tweaking the model to be able to address what you see, but how have you actually done that?
It's present in the paper, but you can use an approach basically to try to either oversample underrepresented subgroups or introduce, in our case, sort of variables, markers that are apparently less biased on which to do this. I mean, in a field that not ours, in imaging, right? There was a big paper that made a lot of noise about you could take chest X-rays with no other labeling, and you can make a very, very accurate determination of race. A physician can, a machine can. And so if you're just sort of building AI on chest X-rays, it can be very heavily biased. On the other hand, if you took that explicitly into account and fed it back in and said, sort of carefully, you can structure, for instance, neural network to say, don't pay attention to this or correct for this. Then you could get an algorithm on the far side that's not that doesn't have a representation of race that was present in the underlying bias data.
So this is really insightful, and I think what many of us want to know is when you all are successful with the work that you're embarking in, both individually and with your teams, what's going to be different? What is your impact? Your target for making the precision of the diagnostic work that you're targeting better 10, 15 years from now? I think, Tim, you touched on it, but if you had to give a 2 or 3 liner on what was going to be different when you were done, what would that be?
Are we going to go around or what's?
Yeah, we'll start with you, Bobby.
All right. So for us, I think it's about getting the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. And I think in acute care and in hospitals and in the ED, the challenge is that the health signature of the patient changes dramatically. It can change dramatically over time versus like cancer or chronic diseases. So it's about constantly doing the profiling of the patient. And a piece of that, which we haven't talked about too much, is making sure you're running the right diagnostics on the patient. So just running the same test on all patients may not make sense. And so kind of intelligently knowing what you know about the patient right now and what information could really help you make a better decision. So you're choosing the right diagnostic test and then combining all that data together to make the right decision for the treatment decision for the patient. That's really what we want to see in the future.
Jeremiah?
I think the goal of our group is to reduce uncertainty. And we're trying to do that via multiple pathways. The first pathway is by basically exposing all of the information that is already there So one way that information can be exposed is through AI algorithms that that really create a risk profile for a patient based on things that are embedded in the EHR. And another way is just by algorithmic processing of data and presenting it in a more simplified way to a patient. And then I think the next way is what was just spoken of, suggesting what the next step is, right? So you have this idea, the patient is sick, you're not sure exactly why. We would suggest that you move forward with the next diagnostic, and maybe it pushes someone to the technology that Tim is developing, or maybe it pushes someone to a different technology. But I think it's about taking the human being who is there, seeing the patient, and reducing their uncertainty by maximizing the utility of the information that's there already.
Deco.
For us at BrainScope, I think it's about ensuring proper brain health. And we all agree outcomes are really relevant, and you have to have good CNS outcome. And so for us on the diagnostic side is making sure, that our device can accurately rule out an intracranial hemorrhage. So something really, really important. And do that in a titrated fashion without radiation. So that's really important on the front end. But then also, many of these patients are injured, and following these patients. So following these patients that may have concussion, ensuring that they get better, having an objective measure that they're on the road to recovery. And that's a game changer because we've never been able to do that. So that's really the focus of what we're doing at BrainScope.
That's fantastic. And Tim?
I'll give you an example of which I think we're a part. So, today a person comes in with suspected pneumonia. They're going to get probably some combination of CBC, CNP, lactate, maybe a procalcitonin, maybe a nasal swab, definitely a sputum culture, maybe a blood culture, chest X-ray. You're looking like 7 or 8 tests. And the New England Journal says you run those tests, maybe about 45% of the time you get an accurate diagnosis of what's going on, underneath. Is it bacterial? Is it viral? Is it uninfectious? Whatever. I think the idea of improved diagnostics should be somebody comes in with a syndrome, a fever, and we can quickly say what kind. Okay, so you're dealing with something bacterial, right? And now you can sort of choose the right diagnostics. Okay, now we're going to choose rapid, direct from sample, ID and AST. So that patient went from getting, 8 tests and the wrong treatment to 2 or 3 tests and the right treatment, all in a very short amount of time. And people that are doing things that have nothing to do with us, things like next-gen sequencing for pathogen ID as a downstream mop-up, improvements in things like direct from sample and culture when the patient is actually likely to have bacteremia. All of it will become this sort of spectrum that hopefully yields faster treatment, but also with the benefit of fewer tests and sort of it should overall bring better outcomes and lower costs, and frankly, less time in the emergency department, which is, I think, all of our goal.
We're heading into our final 5 minutes here of our discussion. Just wanted to go around for any final comments from each of you. This has been a great session. I think many of us have crossed paths multiple times and have been able to work with many people who are joining this conference today. And so this has been, I think, at least from my perspective, great to hear a bit more about what you're doing, to have this conversation live, but wanted to just go around and offer you an opportunity just to add in some final comments as we finish out our session. And so I'm going to go around on my screen. So Deku, if you wouldn't mind going first.
So I would say this is an exciting time right now. And I would say that, we have a lot of really smart minds, especially within our resident and fellow group, and really think about how you can help on the technology side and helping medicine, helping emergency medicine. And I know we have our classic fellowships and you all know them, right? But, thinking about today, would I do a fellowship in AI and in informatics? Would that be a benefit? Or would I look at things like biodesign? There's other options out there. So certainly for the medical students, residents, think about options like this that can continue to contribute to the future of our field.
Thank you. And Jeremiah.
Yeah, I think, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. And it is indeed an exciting topic, not just diagnosis, but I think decision-making in general in emergency medicine right now. I think one of the exciting things about the future for me is to see where we land in terms of the interface between human beings, us, the emergency physicians, and all of this technology. Right. So I think that's actually the area where we have a lot of work to do. I think that's the place where a lot of people who are here can really get involved in helping us push the envelope on how we can create synergy between human decision making and computer-driven decision making to achieve an optimal outcome for patients.
Fantastic. And Bobby?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think it's amazing that we have panels like this. I think it's about time. I mean, if you look at the world, everything is about data. Everything is personalized now, from your Netflix choices to your Google searches. So it's kind of crazy that healthcare's lagged behind that. But I think this is the, we're in this process of potentially a revolution, right? Where we treat patients based on their unique health signatures, not based on one-size-fits-all protocols. And I think it's really, really important work that at some point is going to affect probably all of us, or if not one of us, then one of our loved ones. So I think it's past time, and we got to get to work.
All right, and Tim.
I guess I would say I think innovation is really a team sport. This absolutely. If you're interested in engineering, you can come work for us and help build new things. But even a new diagnostic, as was discussed earlier, needs to be integrated in a decision support system, and it has to be evaluated by clinical trialists, and it has to be, if it's been evaluated well, put into guidelines, and then it has to be at a systems level, reimbursed, brought through, other sort of systems of implementation. So I would just say, I don't think there's it doesn't matter what your interest is in emergency medicine, innovation will impact some part of it, and we'd love your help. And for those on the call that don't frequently work with industry, please understand, we very much want to work with you. You'd be surprised at how many opportunities there are to collaborate across really that entire sort of product life cycle, from concept all the way through to sort of late implementation. And so I think that's how we'll ultimately end up making a difference in patients' lives is by working together.
And that was a fantastic concluding point. I think, thank you for all of your final comments. And this has been a really dynamic session. I think I've learned a lot today. I want to thank all of our participants who shared questions in the chat that we presented to our speakers. And in the words, I think a couple folks here, this is a team sport. Let's get to work. And so with that, I'll hand over to Dr. Lowe.
Wow, that was an amazing discussion. I kind of feel like it was future looking, and at the same time still left me with a lot of questions. And that's why I kind of typed in that final question in the chat, which I wish we had time to answer. Like, I would love to hear from you all what you think precision diagnostics in emergency medicine looks like in 50 years, in 20 years, or in 10 years even. I love having those discussions because it gets everyone's imagination going. And I think still, even though this is science, right, a lot of medicine and a lot of what we do still taps into our imaginations and in imagining what's possible with the tools that we have. So this was great. This was our last panel discussion. So anybody here, obviously you're welcome to leave, but I would encourage you to go join us in the pitch competitions. I've been dropping in from time to time to listen in on the startups. And these are groups that are working with the current technology and trying to iterate on it and create those future 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. So it's pretty fun and exciting to me. If you're a fan of like Shark Tank or those kind of competitions, I think you would be especially interested in joining us for the last two pitches. You can go ahead and exit with the little door on the bottom left of your screen, and then go ahead and click on the pitch competition room and join them in there. Fun stuff. Hope to see you guys there. I know I will be there, and then we'll wrap it up after that with the awarding of the winner. And just to wrap up, goodbye. See you next year.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Take care, gentlemen.
Thank you. Bye-bye.